Welcome to Marie's Botanical Gardens, and I'm coming to you from the historic Spanish Point campus today. And we're going to talk a little bit about the archaeology, regional history, and the plants and people, the plants of the historic Spanish Point campus and their uses. So why is an archaeologist talking about plants? I'm sure some of you may have that question. And the reason I'm talking to you about plants today is because when we're doing our research, any archaeological research, we have to talk about plants and how humans interacted with their environment. So as you know, as an archaeologist, I'm an anthropologist, and we study humans. But I study the past cultures through their material remains. And I'm sorry, I think that picture might be covering the words, but that's what it says there. So we study the material remains. And the artifacts that we study are objects that are modified and made by humans. These could be vessels such as pottery that were used for storage, cooking, ceremonial purposes. And in those artifacts, often we find residue from food items that were cooked, where they maybe cooked berries or seeds that they had foraged from the surrounding community. And we also look at tools that were made by the past inhabitants that lived there. And oftentimes those tools also are made from plants from that surrounding environment. Often here, I'll show you a shell tool. I carry this one around a lot because I really like it. But when we find this and we pick up an artifact like this, we get really excited because we say, that's a shell tool. I know that's a shell tool. In this case, we believe this was a boat making tool, possibly a chisel. And then we'll grab a stick really quick off the ground and say, hey, where did the stick go and how did they use it? But the important thing to remember there is they wouldn't have been able to use some of these tools if they didn't have the plants surrounding them. And then what type of plant would they have used? What type of branch may have been strong enough to put in that shell to actually put a lot of pressure on it or to use it as a hammer? And then furthermore, how was it attached? We know that animal tendons can be very good for attaching wooden spears or handles to different artifacts, but fibers were used as well. So we want to look at all of those things and take them into consideration while we're working and record our findings. So with that said, there are specialized archaeologists. There are some archaeologists that study zooarchaeology, and they know every single animal and they can identify their bones. And then there's some archaeologists that focus on biology. They want to know more about the humans and what type of illness or disease or basically what their overall health was. Were they healthy? In our case, at Historic Spanish Point, we know that they were healthy. And then we also have ethno-archaeobotanists. I'm sorry, did not get that out right. Archaeobotanists, and archaeobotanists are going to study the plant remains and the vegetation that was used. So they would come in and say, I'm studying household archaeology. I want to see how the site was used, how the particular spot that we're excavating, are there features like posts? Maybe there was a house there. Were they making shell tools there? Were they making pottery there? But an archaeobotanist is going to come along and say, hold on, I want to gather the pollen, the seeds, the residue from those artifacts that we're finding. So we might have different questions. We all will have the same goal in looking for answers about the people who inhabited that area, but we might have different questions. So we'll also take into consideration with regards to the vegetation, beyond being used for tools or for food, the other purposes that they may have had, leaves, bark, berries, fruit could have been used to make different teas for medicinal purposes, for example. And then also we think about what arts and crafts they were making. Were they carving masks like we may see with the Calusa culture that many of you are familiar with? And if so, then these may have been representative of ceremonialism. So we have a lot of questions that we can ask. So this is where the crossover comes with botany and archaeology. All right, so I'm going to jump into a different topic so that we can get started down our conversation with the plants. I want to talk about some of the plant communities that we have here at the historic Spanish Point campus. And first of all, we might say, well, that's a plant community, Amy. So a plant community is a grouping of plants that are all dependent on the same type of environment. They all rely upon the same type of soil, the same type of maybe salt, as in the case of mangroves, that sort of thing. And here at HSP, our historic Spanish Point campus, we have 4 different plant communities that we can talk about. The first one is going to be the Shell Ridge, and some of you might recognize that from our Shell Ridge midden that's located along the southern side of the site, running east to west. And that is the area of the site that the White Cottage sits on top of. And it extends all the way out to the end of the peninsula. So it starts at Mary's Chapel and runs all the way to the end of the peninsula. And the second plant community we'll talk about is the mangrove. And the third is the coastal hammock. And last, the pine flatwoods. I think you're all pretty familiar with the mangroves and can recognize that very quickly. And you probably have them in some of your own neighborhoods. And then the coastal hammock areas are going to be your areas that border the Shell Ridge close to White Cottage. When you're walking from the parking lot, you're going to walk through that coastal hammock, and also over close to the Guptill House. And then our pine flatwoods are a little bit to the east. As you're driving in, you'll see some of the pine flatwood plant community. All right, so going into the Shell Ridge community, I put a picture on here for you. This is from the excavation, and this is out at the very tip of the point. If you take the new pathway out by Point Cottage, we were doing excavation out there this past fall with students from Florida Gulf Coast University. And the reason I chose this picture was so that you could see what it looks like when we dig down. I know that you're all familiar with A Window to the Past, but this is pretty much what's underneath of your feet when you're walking on top of that midden and you're walking out on that pathway. And what I wanted you to notice was the density of shell. So at this point here, this is probably about 50 to 60 centimeters down. When you get to about 100 centimeters, you're standing in water. But the shell continues all the way down. The middens are well drained because of this density of stacked shell. So if you walk on the beach, and after we've had a high tide or a storm event, sometimes you can actually see little trails of water coming down from the midden, and that's from the midden actually draining. And because of the shell, there's a high density of calcium carbonate, and a lot of plants thrive in this environment because of the calcium. And out in this area, and on the Shell Ridge, we'll find very diverse vegetation. There's a lot of native plants specific to this community. And this is considered a tropical hammock of sorts. So these Shell Ridge communities can be found all through coastal Florida, and their commonality is that they all have these similar plants that grow there. Some of the plants that we may find growing on the Shell Ridge community will be prickly pear, cactus, saw palmetto, mulberry, cabbage palm will be there, as well as white stopper, gumbo limbo, marlberry, prickly apple, Jamaica caper, wild lime, and red mulberry. And I can tell you that there is a lot of wild lime out where we were working, because you get caught on it the whole time that you're working. So for the Native Americans that were here, and for the pioneers, this would have been a very good spot to be able to forage nuts and berries and various roots and fruits as well. So keeping in mind that that area, the middens that we have on our site date back as far as 5,000 years ago. So on the archaic midden and on the Shell Ridge midden, both, we can find some similarities in these plants, and there's a reason that people chose to live here. There was a diverse environment. You have the coastal environment, and then you have these plant communities that you're able to get your sources from for food, wood, fire, and such. All right, our mangrove community. The mangrove community is a tropical and subtropical community. These plant communities can be found all over the world. The Plants that are in the mangrove community thrive in the salt water, and they offer shoreline protection. As you know, they're very dense, so they stabilize the shorelines and they help protect our shores during storms, during high tide events, during high winds. So actually during a hurricane, they can help protect that shoreline. They also offer a nursery for the marine habitat. And we know we have a healthy ecosystem whenever our mangroves are thriving and our fish are able to hide underneath the roots of the mangroves. And we'll find fish, shellfish, and crustaceans that are dependent upon these mangroves as their nursery. And that also creates an excellent food source for the other fish in the environment: snook, tarpon, jack, sheepshead, redfish, oyster, shrimp, and birds. So this area provided an excellent habitat for the Native Americans and for the pioneers, and even for us today to use as a food source. A lot of our fisheries are reliant upon, whether it's for sport or for food, are reliant upon these mangrove communities and the health of them. We'll get a little further into the mangroves later. They're really special to me because they have purposes, firewood, medicinal purposes, dyes, building materials. They're very important to our community. So we'll go on to the coastal hammock, and this kind of shows you a little bit of the Shell Ridge, obviously in front of White Cottage, and we know that White Cottage sits on top of that Shell Ridge midden. But if you look kind of over to the right, to the east of it, you start to see some of this coastal hammock community, and you walk through it as you walk down the high path coming up while you're visiting or while you're here on campus. So the coastal community consists of a clump of broad-leaved trees, and they're surrounded by contrasting plants as their understory. The trees require that bright light. The understory doesn't require quite as much light, but they contrast and they create a very healthy environment for animals and humans alike. A lot of our hammocks in Florida have been destroyed by development throughout Florida. So we're fortunate to have all of this wonderful vegetation and variety, if you will, of different types of plant communities here on our 30-acre site. Most of ours is primarily tropical. You will think of maybe some other places in Florida, there'll be different types of hammocks. Up through Central Florida, you'll kind of go through, see more oak hammocks. So I'm sure as you've taken road trips, you can notice the changes quite easily as you go from West Coast to the East Coast through Central Florida up through North Florida. Our coastal hammock here consists of live oak, red cedar, pignut hickory, cabbage palms, and wax myrtle. It also supports epiphytes. So I always encourage everybody to take a look up. We have a lot of beautiful orchids and moss. A lot of people kind of go, oh, there's moss all over the tree, and they see it as a negative, but it is a beautiful epiphyte. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, it has many purposes. We have some beautiful butterfly orchids that can be found on site, as well as our resurrection ferns that are, as you know, in the Pioneer Cemetery by White Cottage, over by Guptill, and they are absolutely beautiful and an important part of our coastal hammock community. I also want to mention that there's some plants that in this habitat that are endemic to Florida. And this community created an excellent source of nuts, hardwoods, and food for the Native Americans and for the pioneers, and still today. All right, our pine flatwoods. And most of you are familiar with this. I know a lot of you are really active, and you might, I took this picture when I was out cycling, actually south of here. This isn't right here. This is down in Punta Gorda. But I know that you're all very familiar with our pine flatwoods. The pine overstory, and then the understory is palmetto and grasses. The pine flatwoods are dependent on periodic fire. Naturally, they would have occurred from lightning. As many of you know today, they're controlled fires. If you don't have the fires regularly, the hardwoods will replace the pine eventually, and the saw palmetto becomes more dense, so you start to lose your pine flatwoods. Primarily, our pine flatwoods consist of slash pine. At one time, we had longleaf pines as well. However, in the early half of the 20th century, they were exploited. The wood is strong, so unfortunately, many of them were cut down, and the slash pine grows more rapid, so it replaced the longleaf pines that we had. Pine is used for many purposes. Primarily, we'll get into the boat building purposes that it serves later and the uses, and it's still a very important tree to us today. All right, so if you have a piece of paper and a pen or an iPad or something you want to jot down names of trees or plants, the next few slides I go to are going to list some of the plants and shrubs and vines, etc., that we have on the historic Spanish Point campus or have had in the past. There is only one that is not known to have been on our site. However, it was nearby and it was of important use to the Native Americans that were here. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But the reason I asked you or told you might want to write some down, you may recognize the name of some of them, and you may have a more in-depth question or want to know a specific purpose. We would be here all day if we tried to cover every single one of them, but I want you to write down the ones that you're interested in, and either myself can do some research and find that out for you or answer that, as well as Bruce and Liz at the end of the call. So again, just put your questions in the comments. Okay, so our types of plants that we have are trees, shrubs, cacti, vines, epiphytes, agave, and cycads. And if I'm saying that wrong, I really am sorry. But those are the different types of plants that we'll find here. And then we'll talk about what they were used for. So our plants were used for food, and the inhabitants that lived here, not only during the Archaic period up through the Woodland period, or which we refer to the people that lived here as the Minnesota period people, the Spanish fishermen, or the Cuban fishermen, I'm sorry, that may have had ranchos here, all the way up through the pioneers, foraged for wild foods, gathering those nuts and berries and roots and tubers and fruits and seeds. There was no cultivation of crops until the Webbs came during the pioneer period. But the Native Americans that were here were not cultivating crops. They didn't need to. They had everything that they needed right here in this surrounding environment. And then shelter. Palm fronds were used for a roof. They make an excellent covering. Oak and cedar, mangroves, they were used for structures, for posts, for floors, for racks for meat. And these are all various uses that were used through people that were here during all different periods of time. And then we talk about fiber, and it is amazing how many different plants that we can use for fiber and plants that we have right here on our site. So fiber would be used for cordage, and that may have been used for fishing nets, stringing beads for jewelry, attaching tools, like I mentioned earlier, for building structures, if you were attaching two posts or creating a roof structure. Also, fiber was used to weave mats, make baskets, different types of adornments. It was used as timber and pottery. And then for ceremonial purposes, there's a site on the other side of Florida where fiber was found during the Archaic period. That site dates back to about 8,000 years ago. And the mats were found from woven plant fibers. I did bring in just a little bit of, I grabbed that out of my cabbage palm tree today. So, you know, when we start to really look around, it's in front of us everywhere. And that's a nice thing to show visitors because we have a lot of cabbage palms, as you all know, on our site. And then firewood, I skipped implements, so I'll go back to that in a minute. But firewood, we have a lot of sources of firewood here. And for different purposes, pine burns much faster, for example, than black mangrove or buttonwood. But we have a lot of sources that would have been used for that and to make charcoal. And then back to the implements, that kind of takes us back a little bit to I mentioned the fishing nets earlier. So also fishing hooks as well. We do know that some fishing hooks were made from bone, but they would have been made from wood, most likely as well. And then tools for building. So the tool handles or other tools and for hunting. So Native Americans that were here, even up through the pioneer period, even today, humans still like to craft weapons and tools from the trees that we can find in our surrounding environment. And medicinal, I mentioned as well, leaves, berries, barks, roots, all sorts of things were used for medicinal purposes. And we're starting to see a resurgence in that even today. So this is something that the Native Americans would have used all the way up through when the pioneers were here. And then today we're seeing that as well. And I'm learning a lot from individuals and visitors that we have on the site that talk to me about some of their holistic practices. And I have been reading more and more about people using plant medicine. So this is something that's been used through time, the same types of plants. And then ceremonial, we're going to get into that later. There's one particular plant that is in this region that we believe was most likely used here for ceremonial purposes. And then arts, I have a little picture up there of some, paint temper, and the Calusa masks were painted that they found. And those paints were made from different plants and vegetation. And we can imply that that was possibly done here as well, because the same plants that were used to make those paints and to tan leather were also found here. All right, so here's our list I told you about. So these are the trees. These are not all of the trees that we have on the historic Spanish Point campus. This is just a handful. And the reason I put these on the list is most of these are on the site, and all of them were used for some sort of purpose by Native Americans, and still today by other cultures around the world. So I'm going to leave it there for a minute. The sable palm is our cabbage palm, saw palmetto, gumbo limbo, slash pine, live oak, red cedar, wax myrtle. I could keep going on. To name a few, sable palm or the cabbage palm and the saw palmetto were very good for fiber, for food sources, for seeds, for crafting different things such as baskets. White stopper was also used for medicinal purposes, as well as hackberry and soapberry, wild lime, and then our red grove and mangrove had many purposes, as well as the sea grape and the buttonwood. So those are some of our trees. And then I listed some of the shrubs that can be found here on our site. And you'll see that we have marlberry, myrcene, wild coffee. And wild coffee is not edible, so don't let your neighbor think that they can go pick some wild coffee and take that home and try to brew it. They won't feel very good if they do that. Lucky nut, actually we have one. I don't think it'll last very long because I'm pretty sure that Daryl is not going to let that stay too long. But we have a lucky nut out by Guptill if you want to see what that looks like. And it actually has a green, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture, but it has like it looks like a little green tomato kind of to me hanging off of it. Scorpion's tail was useful for medicinal purposes. Yaupon holly is the only one that we don't have on the site and that we do not have record of having on the site. But the reason it's on there is it was in the region and it was used for a special drink. And I have a slide on that a little while later. Snowberry, And Spanish bayonet provided very good fiber that could be woven. So here we have our prickly apple, which I think you're all familiar with. That's not the best picture, but it does grow along the beach on the Shell Ridge Midden. I'm sorry, our prickly pear, not our prickly apple. I apologize for that. Our prickly apple, you will not see on the site. If you do, please let someone know. It is protected. It has been on the site. We know that it's here or has been here and has been useful, but it is endangered and protected. And I think the botanist can give you a lot more information on our prickly apple, but they both were sources of food for the Native Americans that were here. The century plant also was a good source of fiber, and Kunti was also used for medicinal purposes. So vines and epiphytes, we have our creeping fig, our snowberry, capbriar, Spanish moss. Spanish moss has its own slide designated later because of the numerous uses of Spanish moss. All right, so now I'm going to jump into one of my personal favorites. This is our sable palm, our cabbage palm. And the photos that I have here that I'll share with you, the center photo is a cabbage palm. I think most of you know what a cabbage palm looks like. This cabbage palm has all of its boots, those growths that go up the cabbage palm. I'm sure that you've all heard the reason why they're called boots is because people would hang their boots out to dry when they were out moving cattle and that sort of thing. And they would hang them on there to dry their boots. So they call them boots on the cabbage palm. Some trees have them all, like this one. Some trees don't. Some just lose them. Bruce and Liz may be able to elaborate a little bit more on that for you. But cabbage palm is the state tree for Florida. And it is not a true tree. It is actually more related to a grass. So that's the center picture is your cabbage palm. And then over to the left, I put a picture of a structure. This is a modern day structure. This is a chiqui. You will see these if you go out onto the Seminole Reservation, if you go out to visit the Atatiki Museum, which I highly encourage that you do. You will see these behind the homes of the individuals that live on the reservation, and they can be used for anything to park cars underneath them, to hang out so that you have a spot to socialize. And I've seen people put gems underneath of them, but these are still built today. This happens to be in my own yard, but you've probably been to a bar or a restaurant or, you know, where you might have a tiki bar. Most of these were built by Seminole that have a company that will come out and build these for different businesses. But I think it's fantastic for us to stop and note whenever we're underneath one of these shelters, how much cooler the air is. So we can really imagine what a wonderful shelter this created, a comfortable shelter in an environment that could be quite warm. And it's also very hardy and very strong. The palm fronds are, once you layer them, they can withstand hurricane winds and they do not let water seep in. So I also want to talk about the cabbage palm as food. I'm sure most of you have had hearts of palm on a salad or just by itself. You also can cook the palm, the heart of that palm tree, and make swamp cabbage. If you haven't had it before, I would definitely recommend having it. It's very good. But these are different ways that this tree has provided food for thousands of years, really, and even still today. And the fiber can be used for a multitude of purposes, to weave baskets, to weave mats, almost anything you could think of weaving. The cabbage palm could provide that. And I put paintbrush on there because the palm fronds, when they're taken apart, make excellent paint brushes. And then tinder, as you know, once the palm fronds dry out, they make excellent tinder, as well as the fiber that comes out from between the boots. It burns very quickly. We do know that the cabbage palm provided a shelter for the Webbs when they came, most of the Florida pioneers. It's documented that when they came to Florida and they were moving along these coastlines or setting up maybe even temporary residences in Florida, that they were making these palm thatched roofs. All right, Yaupon holly. So this one right here, this plant has not been found on our site, as I mentioned before, but it has regionally. So we do know that this holly was used to make a ceremonial black drink. And the reason there's a picture of a seashell there is because that is a lightning whelk. And it is known that the whorl, which is the outside section of that whelk, will be removed and served well as a cup. And in ceremonial, during ceremonies, the black drink would have been put into that cup and drink from there. It's unique that it contains caffeine and it's considered medicinal. So the leaves were roasted and then they were boiled, frothed, and strained, and that would make this tea or this black drink. And it could be used as an emetic. In other words, it could make you vomit, but that's only if more than a normal amount, someone had drank more than normal, and maybe they were trying to induce that as well. It's commonly found on the coast throughout Florida, and it's also known that Native Americans would travel to the coast to partake in this drinking of this black drink. So there are records of it being throughout the Southeast, but it was primarily along the coast where it was coming from, and it was most likely traded. I like to add it because it was here in our region, and we can infer that it was most likely used by the Native Americans that were living here. Okay, so I wrote possible uses at the top because I wanted to kind of put red mangrove and black mangrove on here together, since they can be found together in that mangrove community that we talked about earlier. Both the red mangrove and the black mangrove make very good fuel, and the black mangrove was commonly used to make charcoal. Both of them provided excellent wood for building. They both provided excellent dyes. I believe from most of my research that the black mangrove dye was preferred over the red mangrove dye due to the color. Both had medicinal purposes. And the red mangrove also made an excellent incense, as it smelled very good when it was burned. And both were used for tanning. So the red mangrove is the one that looks like it's walking. So, if a visitor asks you, oftentimes I have people ask me the difference. Your red mangrove looks like it's walking, and your black mangrove has pneumatophores that they look like fingers that kind of stick right up underneath of them. The black mangrove has flowers that are very fragrant, and they attract honeybees. Honeybees were not here until the Europeans came. We do know that there was honey activity here at historic Spanish Point. So I think that we could say that they may have been acquiring honey from the bees that were attracted to these black mangroves, and it made a very desirable, delicious honey. The black mangrove was also popular for smoking fish. We'll get to mangrove or buttonwood in just a moment also. Those both were commonly used. And some of the medicinal uses of the mangroves, with the red mangrove, the bark extract is antibacterial. It's an antifungal. It can be used to control diabetes and enhance immunity. And those were actually tested in the lab and verified. So we believe that that was very useful for the inhabitants that lived here in the past as well. And as for the black mangrove, medicinal purposes, it's an astringent and can be used to treat diarrhea and hemorrhaging. So we can imagine that both of them may have been very useful if someone was suffering from an ailment. Both are used for tanning, and tanning is the process of turning raw animal skins basically into leather so that you kind of end up, with something like that. And the leaves, the barks, or the leaves, the bark, the roots are all soaked in water, and the skin is soaked in with that water that releases these tannins. And it gives a color not only to the animal hide, but it also creates or gives it a resistance to water and to heat, and also other organisms that may want to eat that animal skin. And also, I want to add with the black mangrove that the salt may have been harvested from the black mangrove. It's easy to take that salt from them, and that would have also been something that was useful to the Native Americans as well as the pioneers. So both of these trees were very important, and as I stated before, the mangrove community provided so much. Not only did it provide all of these things, the wood, the fruit, dyes, medicinal, but it also protected that coastal environment, which we know everyone who has inhabited the site for 5,000 years has been dependent upon. Okay, so live oak and slash pine. Live oak is a good food source. So we know that acorns can be gathered and they can be eaten. I'm not telling you to go eat one, but when I was a kid growing up in Central Florida, we used to crack them open and eat them, and they actually taste somewhat sweet, but that would be an acorn from a live oak. Most acorns are more bitter. The acorns also could be roasted, just like you would roast other nuts over fire. They could provide flour, they could be made into flour, and they also could have the oil extracted from them. Live oak is a very heavy wood. It can be used for many purposes. We know that oak is used to build furniture. It made an excellent firewood because it would burn slower. And it's also been used in shipbuilding and in boat building. So oak trees can live for hundreds of years. As you know, we have several very old oak trees here. And John and Will Webb actually had to build a mill for their sugarcane, and they used oak to build the cogs and wheels. And we can only imagine all of the other purposes that they would have used oak for as well. And then slash pine, many of the dugout canoes that have been recovered from archaeological sites were made from pine. Pine also made excellent building materials. They could be used for fencing, for furniture. And also, we know that Will Webb and Frank Updell used pine to build the keel on one of the schooners that they built in the late 1800s. And John and Will Webb, on that same sugar mill that they built, where they used the oak for the cogs and wheels, they used pine logs as the rollers. So I have resin used for boat building. I think most of y'all are familiar with this. Turpentine, pitch, pine tar oil, and resin are all collected, or made from the tar that's taken from pine, or from the resin that's taken from the pine tree. And the slash pine, it sounds exactly like it is. Slashes were made in the pine, and then the resin would come out and be gathered, and then that would be used to make all of the other turpentine pitch that we all just mentioned, or that I just mentioned. It's quick burning. As you know, it could be used to get a fire going pretty quickly. You probably wouldn't want to use oak to start your fire, but pine with some of your palm fibers, you could have got a good fire going. Gumbo limbo and southern red cedar. The gumbo limbo has medicinal purposes. It's incense. It was used as an incense because of its fragrance. In some archaeological contexts, such as in Pineland, which is south of us, they have found gumbo limbo was used as float pegs on the Native American fishing nets. And also the resin is collected from the gumbo limbo. The tree leaves actually do taste like turpentine, and the resin that is taken from the gumbo limbo can be used to make glue, varnish, coating for canoes, and as I mentioned, incense in churches. Today in the Caribbean, leaves are used for wasp and bee stings. So you could take the leaf and kind of crumble it up and put it on a sting, and it'll help relieve the pain. And that they also make a tea from the leaves. The root, bark, and leaves can be used for different ailments and made into a tea, like some of the other plants. And there is a theory that the Native Americans used this sticky resin that came out of the gumbo limbo to capture birds. So they may have used this to catch birds, not for their diet that they were eating, but it is documented later that individuals had used the sticky resin to capture birds that they were taking on ships and trading. The red cedar, Frank Guptill and Will Webb used red cedar from Casey Key across the way, but we also have it here, to build the frame on a schooner. And red cedar is also very fragrant, so it was used for cigar boxes, for chests, for maybe lining different things to protect it from certain insects, and just to be able to enjoy the fragrant smell whenever you open something that has cedar in it. It's easily carved, so it may have been a choice for masks, such as the masks that we saw that the Calusa had, or perhaps other artifacts that we'll never know existed, that we can only assume that there was maybe statues carved or different types of beads. But wood artifacts do not, they deteriorate in Florida. The environment is not ideal for them, and they have to be in an anaerobic environment in Florida to preserve them. So that's why we have a minimal amount of wooden artifacts in our state. Okay, Spanish moss and buttonwood. So Spanish moss, I have over here skirts. It's documented that when the Spanish came to Florida, that the women were wearing skirts made of Spanish moss that were either attached at their waist or attached up at the top of their chest. So they were using it as clothing. It was also used as timber for pottery because it does burn so easily. And it could be used as tinder to start a fire. Spanish moss was used by the pioneers for bedding, upholstery, pillows, anything you could think of these days that we might have down filling for, or that polyfill. They most likely were using Spanish moss. So it really provided comfort, whether it was clothing or maybe laying your head down on your mat or your bed to go to sleep on a Florida summer night. So also Spanish moss can be woven into rope, and it's a very strong rope when it's woven. And before Spanish moss can be used for these purposes, it does have to be treated, or should be treated. So Spanish moss has that greenish gray color. It would be soaked in water for a period of time to remove that grayish green, and then it would turn black, and then you leave it out to dry. I imagine that probably also took care of the insects that can live in Spanish moss as well, because you wouldn't want those on your pillow with you or in your clothing. So buttonwood leaves and bark are used for tanning. The wood was used for boats, to make boats that floated. If you think of maybe a wooden raft, they were used as posts. And today we know that in Mexico, the bark can be used as an astringent or for medicinal purposes. In Cuba, it's used to treat fever. In Brazil, it's given to people who are weak or anemic. So we can again imply that based on what we know about modern day uses, that they probably were used by the inhabitants that were here in the past for maybe some of those similar reasons. It provided excellent fuel wood and was used to make charcoal. And it's still a source of fire today. So when people have bonfires on beaches in Florida or through the tropics, oftentimes they're collecting driftwood, and that driftwood is quite often buttonwood. It is also was a choice along with black mangrove for smoking fish. And it's still used by the Seminole today for a variety of purposes. So as for all of the uses, I just wanted to highlight a few. Like I said, there's so many plants on this site that have a variety of purposes that have been used and documented through different periods of time by humans. And we can say that it could have been very likely that they were used by the Native Americans here based on what we know today. So through practicing some ethnoarchaeology, and that's studying the living descendants today of the inhabitants that were once here and learning about different cultures, we can apply what we learned to certain areas or certain regions and theorize that those traditions and uses have been passed down and shared. Okay, so plants and people today. And I threw this kind of goofy little picture up there to share with you all because, you know, if you're talking to visitors or you're talking to children, if they're coming through on a field school trip or a homeschool trip, it's important for people to really understand that we're still reliant on these plants. We're not foraging like we did at one time, but it's still a part of our day-to-day lives. And this is I grabbed all of this stuff in my own house today. And, you know, there's food, jewelry, bags, hammocks. Well, the hammock's not on there, but, you know, shelter, furniture, you get the idea, so much more. But I threw, you know, there's seeds, there's coconuts. And I would almost go as far as to say that coconut is like one of our palm trees. I feel like coconut's used for everything now. There's a indigo. Is still used as a dye. There's some handcrafted wood tools there. Also, we know that wood is crafted into different instruments and has been for thousands of years. So I just kind of threw that up there because I thought it was fun to start thinking about how we still rely on our plants and oftentimes even ones in our own surrounding environment. And as for foraging, we're still foraging. And I think that that's really fascinating to see, read more and more or see talks on people who are foraging for fruits, some mushrooms, which have become really popular at farmers markets. And just like the ever popular black truffle, if you haven't seen the movie Pig recently, it's all about foraging for a mushroom and at a very high cost. So I kind of wanted to wrap it up a little bit there and, you know, come to my conclusion, what archaeologists learned from past human interactions with the environment. So from an archaeological perspective or point of view, we come in and we gather these material remains or artifacts, and we also, an important part of learning about how that site was used and why those artifacts are there involve the interaction with the humans in their plant environment. And knowing that they chose to settle there, to build a village, to put a hunting camp, whatever their purpose was for being there almost always depends on what the environment can provide for them. So food, shelter, water is the first thing that you think of when you need to survive. And that's the same thing they did. And the environment that we have here in this region and at the historic Spanish Point campus was able to provide humans, and still does and has for 5,000 years, with everything that they could need to have a very good, healthy life. Thank you for joining us for this session today. I appreciate every one of you being here. I know that's kind of a lot that I threw at you, and it's a little bit broad because we really could go in depth with a variety of topics, but I invite you to put your questions in the chat. And if Caitlin's on there and Bruce and Liz, if they can be unmuted so that we can have them join in. All right, so I'm seeing Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, everybody. We have had some questions come through the chat that we've been handling that Bruce and Liz have taken. Thank you very much. And it looks like, does anybody have any questions? If you want to raise your hand or put them in the chat, we still have a couple minutes left. I think everything that's in there has been addressed thus far. Rob, is that a hand up? I'm going to unmute you.
Do we have a question?
You have a question, Rob? No? Okay.
Caitlin, can I add one more quick thing?
Of course.
Because I left it out and I did not mean to leave it out, but we had a report by an archaeologist by the name of Lee Newsom, who's done a lot of archaeobotanical research on sites throughout this area of Florida. And in his 1991 report, he did list some of the plants remains that were found here in an excavation on the historic Spanish Point campus. And just to run through those really quickly, it was cabbage palm, oak, saw palmetto, hickory nut, mastic, stopper, hackberry, red mangrove, black mangrove, buttonwood, gumbo limbo, and cabbage, or I mentioned the cabbage palm earlier. And he did find a small fragment of a gourd, and that is the only one that we have recovered. They are not here on the site. They may have been in the past. So there's some things that may have been here that, by the time plants were documented, they weren't anymore, or it could have been acquired through trade. But I just wanted to add that in there, that those were actually found in context in an excavation on this site.
Thanks, Amy. It looks like Jim has a question. Jim, I think you're unmuted if you want to go ahead.
Sure, I do. In a mangrove community, in addition to the buttonwood and the black and the red, white mangroves occur almost always as a progression of the establishment of a mangrove community. And you didn't mention white mangroves in this, and I don't know if we didn't have any here. I mean, I haven't really seen any. I've seen
Right.
black and I've seen red, and I don't know if they utilize them or
I think it could be implied that there probably were more white mangroves and that they were used. There's not a lot of documentation that I can find in my research of uses for white mangrove. Bruce and Liz might be able to elaborate more. I have not, we have white mangrove is listed as being here in the past on the site, but on a more recent list, it wasn't included. And actually, I did have someone just ask me a week ago, another docent who will be doing the boat tours in the fall. She asked me about it because she hasn't been able to find one on site. Bruce or Liz, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do. Actually, white mangroves are very common on the site. All along the shoreline, you'll find them. I do not know about their uses. I'm sure, no doubt that the flowers are nectar rich and would provide nectar for honey. But and I'm sure the wood is kind of like, it's in the same family as buttonwood. I'm not sure how durable it is, but yeah, so those are two very common things. I just want to throw in a couple of things. So Amy, that was a really great presentation, very well rounded, and Spanish Point is so lucky to have this incredible diversity of plants that's you don't find anywhere else up and down the coast. We found the southernmost population of buckthorn there, and you have things like Hericea, the soapberry, Jamaica caper is really common there. What I find interesting, and some people were asking about that, about the Yaupon holly, it is not known to occur naturally anywhere near there. And I wonder if maybe people were trading for it, or traveling north or south to obtain it. Anyway, it's really great questions. Let me know if there's anything else.
Thank you, Bruce. One from Sean, Amy, Sean says that, do you know if Lucky Nut has ever been found in archaeological sites in Florida? I only ask because the plant is not considered native, so it would be interesting to know if it was cultivated. I'm sorry.
No, it was not. It was, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I had myself muted when Bruce was talking. I know I muted. No, it has not been. So it's invasive, and it just kind of pops up. It's not native, and it hasn't been found on any archaeological sites. And if so, it's just because the same reason we have it here. It's like the Sansevieria and the Brazilian pepper. It pops up, and we try to remove it. But yeah. I mean, Bruce and Liz, you might want to add a little bit more to that one too, but no, not in an archaeological context.
Thanks, Amy. Do you have any other questions? Raise your hand or throw them in the chat. Katie looks like she's got a question. I'm going to unmute you again, Katie.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I was remembering back to when Amy was talking in the beginning about the archaeological dig out at the far point, and saying that they were able to find out what plants were used with which tools, which shells, by doing something. You called it something, Amy. How do they do that? How do they find out which plants were actually used way back when?
We can only imply based on what we know about other archaeological findings. So when Frank Cushing made his discovery in Marco Island in the late 1800s, I believe the year is 1895 off the top of my head. It was remarkable in that they were preserved in an anaerobic environment. So they were in like this peat of sort. And that's the same thing with another site on the other side of Florida called Wendover Pond. Is the wood artifacts were preserved very well. So we look at the surrounding environment, what type of wood was found and how those items or artifacts, how they were used. And then we can only make implications. We can only, based on what we know, using research on what has been found and ethnoarchaeology as to what could have been used. Charcoal's a little bit different. So charcoal is easily collected in an excavation, and that can be sent off to the lab, and it can be determined, the type of wood that was used to make the charcoals. So that we know. And then documentation from when the Europeans did come to Florida. The Spanish had very well-written documents that they took back with them. They met the Calusa as well as other villages and tribes throughout Florida, and they recorded everything that they saw and took that back with them to Europe. So we take all of that knowledge of what we know, and then we just we can't say for sure. I cannot say for sure that for a shell hammer they were using buttonwood, for example. I don't know that because I only have the tool. I don't have the wood left anymore. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thanks, Amy.
You're
All
welcome.
right. Well, if anybody else has a question, now is the time. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Dennis, do you have a question? Dennis, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself first.
All right, very good.
All right, Dennis, you're good.
We have enormous amounts of snake plant, our mother-in-law's tongue, throughout the site. Is there any way to eliminate it?
Liz or
This-
Bruce, do you want to take that?
Yeah.
Hi guys, I can take that. I have way too much history with invasive species, and the short answer for that is it's very difficult to get rid of. Not only is the plant pretty resistant to chemical treatment, it's also very destabilizing for the mound to try to physically remove it. So that's definitely very challenging to do. Some people have had luck in the past with cutting the cuticle of the plant, maybe with something mechanical like a weed eater, and then being able to, chemically spray it. But again, even the chemicals, putting those on the mound can be, in large amounts, can also potentially be damaging. So it's not easy to get rid of, and will be a big challenge for Historic Spanish Point to work on. But they are not unique. If you've been to any other shell mounds in our area, like say Emerson Point is a great example, it's an invader there as well. It really seems to like that calcareous soil, and it has a very robust underground rhizome system that makes it really resistant to being treated, unfortunately. So they need lots of hands and help to just, pull it little by little. If anyone wants to sign up.
Thank you, Liz. Email me.
Can I ask Liz one question, if she doesn't mind elaborating a little bit more? Because I've had this conversation before, and people ask, is actually, and this is from the Sansevieria, I have a lizard on there too, but it's this is the fiber from it. And do you know what the uses were, or can you elaborate on some of the uses were as a cordage, and that it was maybe carried by boats for trade?
Oh, I don't know the uses, Amy. I'm sorry. I'm not sure. Bruce, you may know. But it is very fibrous. You're absolutely right.
Thank you, Liz. I had a question with Norma, the artist, one day about that. We stopped and we're kind of like, hey, I wonder, and so thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I don't know how extensively it was used or how. But that's a great question. I think that's a good one to look into.
All right. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, so much for spending a part of your Friday afternoon with us. And if you think of any other questions, please feel free to shoot me an email, shoot Amy an email, and we will do our best to consult with our botany colleagues and get back to you. So again, thanks for coming, and we'll see you have a great weekend. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.